everyone is enjoying the retreat so far, and it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. So I'll talk a little bit about pranayama, share some basic information and theory, and then we'll have the opportunity to practice. We'll do a 30-minute practice, yeah, of various techniques so that you all can uh, have a chance to experience some of the various effects and benefits of the different pranayama techniques. Pranayama is, of course, a Sanskrit word that is essentially a combination of two words, prana and ayama. There's a common error that we hear often in yoga studios and yoga classes and whatnot, that pranayama is the control of the breath or the control of prana. It's not a terrible definition necessarily, however. That definition is based upon the combination of the words prana and yama. Yama does mean control, but it's actually a combination of the words prana and ayama. When we combine two words in Sanskrit, one that ends with A, one that begins with A, we cut off one of the A's. And so that is the sort of the source of that confusion. But it's actually a combination of the words prana and ayama. Ayama means expansion. Expansion. And so we can define pranayama then as the expansion of prana. Okay? And of course, it is associated with breathing exercises, which is why oftentimes we hear it defined as the control of the breath or breath control techniques or something like that, which again is not a terrible definition because actually when we practice pranayama, typically we are doing some practices and techniques in which we're attempting to somewhat control the flow of the breath. So it's okay. But we can define pranayama as essentially the expansion and movement of prana through, by means of, the various breathing techniques that we do. Okay? And so prana is typically defined as subtle energy or life force energy sometimes, or astral energy. And so prana is a type of energy that exists on in sort of another plane or another dimension of existential reality. And so that's why typically we can't see prana. Although, of course, there are some folks that do have this capacity or ability or siddhi to see auras and see prana and perceive prana and all this. But typically, we don't perceive prana with the five senses. And so we say that it exists on a more subtle, refined plane or dimension of existential reality. Okay? However, we can experience prana, can't we? So, and we can feel it. We can feel it moving through the body or the astral body, or pranamaya kosha, as it's known in the yoga tradition. And so essentially we practice pranayama to liberate the flow of prana and to move prana around, typically to try and raise prana from the lower chakras to the higher chakras, although there are various techniques that we use to move prana in various ways. Of course, there are five movements of prana, the so-called prana vayus. So there are five different ways in which prana can move. We have prana, apana, udana, vyana, apana, and all of that. So prana can move up, it can move down, it can move outward, it can move inward, and all of this. And well, the sort of default mode movement of prana is to move downward and outward. And for whatever reason, prana likes to move downward and outward. Typically, that's prana taking the path of least resistance, as it were. And this is not ideal. Well, it's not ideal for someone intent on the spiritual awakening path or process, because when prana is flowing downward, it's moving toward the lower chakras, the more base carnal chakras, as it were. And when prana is moving outward, it's moving outward towards the senses. It's moving outward towards the objects of the senses and the distractions, all the shiny objects. And so there's a connection between our attention and our prana that's very important to understand. There's a very common saying that we hear in yoga classes sometimes, where the attention goes, the prana flows, and vice versa. And so that our prana and attention are intricately intertwined or connected. And so when the attention flows outward, the prana follows it, you see. And so that's not ideal. So through the practice of pranayama and also pratyahara, we can invert this natural flow of prana so that the prana is no longer flowing downward and outward, but instead is flowing upward and inward. And so that is one of the purposes or benefits of our pranayama practice and pratyahara practice as well, is to have our attention and prana flowing inward towards the deeper layers of our being and upward towards the higher chakras. And so we can achieve that through various pranayama techniques, Kriya pranayama being the best technique that I've found for doing that. The ancient yogis, well, they were aware of many things that our modern science is just now catching up to. But one of the most interesting gifts that we've inherited from the ancient yogis is the knowledge of the relationship, let's say, between our respiratory states and our mental, emotional, and energetic states, and even physical states. So that every respiratory state has a corresponding mental state, emotional state, energetic state, physical state. And this is the great secret of pranayama or breathwork. I'll repeat that. Every respiratory state has a corresponding mental state, emotional state, energetic state, and physical state. It's all related. What does this mean? Well, if we're interested in controlling our mental states, emotional states, energetic states, physical states, all we need to do is change our breathing patterns. Isn't that fascinating? You know, there's some studies now, fairly recent, that show the efficacy of breathing techniques and chanting Om also for the activation of the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. This is another one of the great benefits of our pranayama practice. And they've done trials with control groups, experimental groups, and all these things, comparing and contrasting the effects of pranayama and chanting Om with anti-anxiety medications like alprazolam, I think it's called. And so this is a medication that folks take who suffer from panic attacks, anxiety, and all this. And so they've compared the effects of a pranayama practice, also chanting Om, with the effects of these pills, and they found that they have almost an equal um, effect on the activation of the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerve is the most important nerve in the parasympathetic nervous system, and it connects essentially the brain with the digestive organs and whatnot, so that when the parasympathetic nervous system is more active, um, we experience better digestion and relaxation. It's the rest and digest side of the nervous system. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's interesting because we were just listening to Roy talk there, and he was discussing the fact that what's so great about the yoga tradition is that anyone can benefit from these practices, regardless of their religious and/or cultural or ethnic background and all that. It's so true, you know. I, I tend to resonate with the Christian or Christian mysticism, let's say, tradition, but that has never impeded my practice of anything from the yoga tradition, nor should it for anyone else. But it does oftentimes. I've come across that quite a bit uh, since I started teaching yoga 20 years ago or whatever. And but it really doesn't matter, if you're Jewish or Muslim or Jain or Buddhist or atheist or whatever. I mean, anyone can benefit from these practices and techniques, regardless of their religious or spiritual background and all that. And so that's really the great gift of these yoga practices that we do. And so it doesn't matter your religious beliefs or background, if you just simply add these practices to whatever tradition you already adhere to or participate in. It can only uh, be of great benefit to you. It will only enhance your religious or spiritual path. And so there's an interesting movement, over the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years to refer to pranayama as breath work in the English language. Here in South America, they say respiración consciente. So like conscious breathing exercises. And so instead of pranayama, which is great, and this opens it up to people that don't necessarily resonate with the yoga tradition of India and all of that. And so you don't need to really vibe with all the stuff from India in order to benefit from a pranayama practice. And so I've kind of gotten into the habit as well as just referring to it as breath work or respiración consciente here in South America, to avoid some of those unfortunate pitfalls that folks experience when it comes to incorporating something from a different culture or religious tradition and all that. And so, of course, we know that many psychologists and doctors in the West are now incorporating these breathing techniques into their practice and recommending them for their clients, which is really wonderful to see, because it's opening it up to a much larger population. So anyone can benefit from these practices, in other words. Pranayama is one of the 8 limbs of yoga, so-called Ashtanga yoga, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's in the 2nd chapter, or pada, of the Yoga Sutras, where Patanjali mentions these 8 limbs. and it's the fourth limb. The first two limbs, of course, are the yamas and niyamas, which are essentially an ethical guideline that we ought to follow in our lives to avoid suffering and future karma and all that. Yeah, but the rest of those limbs are really steps. It's a sequential order that we can follow in our sadhana, or spiritual practice. Starting with asana, which is basically just a comfortable meditation posture, upright, comfortable meditation posture. And then pranayama, these breathing techniques that we do to calm the mind, the energy, the physiology. And then we move on to pratyahara, which is the internalization of attention and prana. And then dharana, which is typically associated with some type of concentration technique like mantra or any concentration technique. Roy in the video we just watched mentioned the Om technique, which is my preferred dharana technique. And then jhana, which is a super conscious state, a clear, thought-free state of tranquil, objective awareness, meditation, in other words. And then samadhi, which are these mystical states that we can experience. And so there's a step-by-step process there that we can follow, given to us by Patanjali. And so, of course, these steps were well known prior to that, possibly for thousands of years. We don't really know. They're mentioned in some of the Upanishads, which are 500 to 1,000 years older than the Yoga Sutras. But Patanjali did a good job of sort of boiling it all down and summarizing everything in a very short treatise. But at any rate, I believe actually pranayama is even mentioned in the Atharva Veda, if I remember that correctly. Don't quote me on that. But at any rate, it's an ancient practice, and it was not unique, by the way, to India. There is evidence of other ancient cultures incorporating breathing exercises for spiritual benefit. But typically, we think of it as coming from primarily from India and from the yoga tradition. And so all of the techniques that we use in the 8 limbs of Patanjali are for the purpose of calming vrittis. Vrittis are these fluctuations or movements or vibrations that cause distractions when we're trying to concentrate, meditate, and all that. And so pranayama does a really wonderful job of not only relaxing the body, the physical body, and the mind to a certain degree, but especially the emotional and energetic body, known as the pranamaya kosha in the yoga tradition. And so an easy way to remember that is that we use pranayama for the pranamaya kosha, right? And so we incorporate pranayama into our practice in order to calm, relax, pacify the vrittis occurring on the emotional, energetic level of our being, which is very useful because, as I'm sure you all know, and anyone that's ever tried to meditate effectively knows that when we're experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil or energetic phenomena, it's very difficult to concentrate and experience a clear, thought-free, tranquil state, of course. So we want to calm all that stuff down before we move on to the next steps. So we don't want to skip any steps, in other words. And so Patanjali gives us this scientific step-by-step sequence to use in order to experience these tranquil, thought-free, transcendent states. And so one of the most important steps really is pranayama, because we need to pacify all that emotional, energetic stuff that's going on before we can really move on to pratyahara and dharana and jhana. Okay? And actually, if we practice pranayama correctly, Pratyahara just sort of occurs organically, naturally, of its own volition. Lahiri Mahashaya, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which I recommend everyone to read if you haven't, it's his writing is cryptic and parts of it are quite difficult to understand. But he does mention in there essentially that if we practice pranayama correctly, that pratyahara just follows naturally, organically. So if we do a good pranayama practice, then this internalization process, the internalization of our attention and prana, just sort of follows naturally after the pranayama practice. And so pranayama has many benefits and many physical benefits. Pranayama can be divided essentially into three categories. It's not quite that simple, but for our purposes, we can think of the pranayama techniques as being divided into three categories, which are essentially the soma or somatic techniques, the more balanced techniques, and the agni techniques. And so those somatic techniques are meant to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which again is responsible for relaxation, digestion, rest and digest, right? So these are the soma techniques or somatic techniques that we can use. Then there are a group of more balanced techniques, such as Nadi Shodhana Pranayama and some others, that are meant to balance the flows of air and balance the flows of prana. Okay? And sort of balance that masculine and feminine energy. So soma is typically thought of as feminine, lunar energy. And Agni is masculine, solar energy. So there's these balance techniques in the middle, and then there's the Agni techniques that are meant to activate that more masculine solar energy, to sort of activate us in some way. And so we've got the soma techniques, the more feminine lunar relaxation techniques, the balanced techniques in the middle that are meant to balance that energetic state, and then the more Agni or activating solar techniques. Okay. But some of the benefits of the somatic techniques is this activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. In our modern culture, our sympathetic nervous system is really overactive, hyperactive. And so that means that that stress response is really hyperactive. It's overstimulated. And so when that sympathetic nervous system is more active, of course, we release adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream and all of that, which results in the stress response and anxiety, fear, and then inflammation problems physically can lead to diseases and all of this. So one great way to combat all of that is to incorporate these somatic techniques into our daily practice to activate the parasympathetic nervous system that helps us to relax. Okay. Also, of course, pranayama does help with our breathing and lung capacity and the tissues around the lungs and all these things, especially when we breathe deeply and slowly. And does help with our digestion. And of course, it helps us to control our mental, emotional, and energetic states. And so when the breath is slower and deeper, more complete, we activate that parasympathetic side of the nervous system. And so we experience relaxation and all of that. Another great benefit of that activation of the parasympathetic nervous system is the activation of the frontal lobes of the brain. So we know that when the parasympathetic nervous system is more active, that brings more blood to the brain, especially the frontal lobes of the brain. When the sympathetic nervous system is more active, our blood flows towards the extremities. This is the fight or flight response in the body. And so the stress response, in other words, so it's not so good to have our blood in the extremities, unless, of course, we're exercising or playing sports or something like that. That's good. Or fighting a mountain lion, on the hiking trail. That's a good thing. But typically we want to have our blood flowing towards the brain, especially the frontal lobes of the brain, which are responsible for concentration, discernment, self-control, willpower, creativity. All that happens in the frontal lobes. Concentration, discernment, willpower, self-control, creativity. All good characteristics for a yogi to have, or anyone to have, right? And so just by practicing pranayama, we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and we can bring more blood to the brain, more blood to the frontal lobes. We improve our powers of concentration, our attention span, and literally uh, change the physiology of the brain through this process of neuroplasticity. So we're literally rewiring the neurons and synapses of the brain with our pranayama practice. And so a few tips for your practice. Try to practice every day, because this helps with that process of neuroplasticity. If we're consistent with it, just like meditation and anything else we do, whether we're learning a new instrument or learning a new language or whatever, it's beneficial to do it every day, even if it's just 15 minutes a day. Okay. And try to practice in a quiet place if you can. Of course, there are certain pranayama practices you can do when you're waiting in line, at the grocery store, or when you're traveling on the subway, or driving your car. I mean, there are certain pranayama practices you can do at any time. You don't have to be formally sitting to practice these techniques. But for your formal practice, your seated formal practice, it is good to practice in a quiet place without distractions, so you can internalize your attention and awareness. And you don't want to have anything. You don't want to have candles or incense burning in the room. You don't want to be inhaling smoke as you practice. Also, you ideally would remove any kind of perfumes from the space. You really shouldn't be using perfumes at all. Perfume, colognes, spray deodorants, and all this. A lot of folks don't know, but perfumes contain petrochemicals and chemicals that are used to make glue. And so when you're inhaling perfume, you're really inhaling petroleum and glue, which is toxic. And so a lot of folks aren't aware of that. But and sadly, many shampoos and soaps and all these things almost all contain perfumes. And so every time we use these products, we're inhaling toxic chemicals into the lungs, and this causes asthma in certain people, allergic responses, reactions in some people, and there's growing evidence that they're actually carcinogenic. And so you want to avoid the use of perfumes. Now, natural oils, essential oils are okay, but at any rate, so try to remove perfumes from the room where you're practicing. Don't burn incense or anything like that. And of course, hopefully no one smokes. Obviously, if you're smoking anything, it's time to move past that. That's not going to benefit you in any way. I'm always surprised when I talk to people that some people still smoke. There's no judgment here. I used to smoke, so whatever. But yeah, it's time to set that aside. That's not serving you in any way. And so you want to be in a quiet clean place with little to no air pollution as you practice. And if you like to listen to calming uh, music while you practice pranayama, you can do that. But just don't listen to music that has a beat, that has like a rhythm, drums in it and stuff, because what happens is our breathing rhythms tend to sync up with the rhythm of the music. So it's better just to have like music that is, like Native American flute or maybe classical music or something like that, or maybe some recording of singing bowls, Tibetan bowls, and stuff like that. But nothing that has like a rhythm, because your breath will want to like try and sync up with that, and your biorhythms, circadian rhythms, and all that. And so you want to be comfortable. So you can sit on a sofa, the bed, wherever you're most comfortable. Okay, sit upright, because you want to be able to expand the chest as you practice and breathe fully and deeply. And sometimes that's more difficult if you're laying down.